Like Ben said, I'm Mark Wainwright. My firm that is just little of me is Wainwright Insight. I provide sales consulting services, fractional sales management to professional services firms of various types. I refer to myself as a part-time sales manager for part-time salespeople like architects and engineers who are reluctant salespeople in their practices. Most of the time they spend delivering their craft, but a little bit of the time they have to spend finding and winning new work. So I help them with that. So today we're going to talk about a strategy for pricing, how choice, options, and a little bit of psychology stuff that happens in our heads can lead to a better and more client-centric approach to price. I am not, I think Ben propped me up there a little bit. I'm not a specifically focused on pricing. I focus on all aspects of professional services sales. Pricing is a small, but I think important part of what I do, and frankly, infinitely interesting to me. And I hope to spark some interest in all of you as well. So here's our agenda. I'm going to throw some slides up that have a good bit of words on them on occasion. And when I do so, I'm going to let all of you read through it. I'll just give you a handful of seconds to read through it because our brains can't read and hear stuff at the same time. It doesn't work. So I'm just going to let people read through slides that I put up that have a good bit of words on them, and then I'll talk through. So here's our agenda if you haven't read through it already. Okay, so we're going to talk about the why and the what of price and pricing strategy and what that's all about, sort of foundational information. We're going to talk about how different pricing is set and some of the problems that come along with those. We're going to pick a few elements of price and pricing strategy to talk about today. There are a bunch, but we're going to talk about a few. And hopefully towards the end, I'm going to be able to really highlight how proposal professionals such as yourselves that are either involved in the genesis of the proposals, finalizing it, managing the whole process. You may even be involved in price, setting price, coming up with price, what you can do to hopefully improve pricing at your firm. Here's our session goals. We want to introduce some new ideas related to price, start to build some awareness that there are good and bad ways to approach pricing. And obviously, I want to spark some interest in all of you and ultimately in your firms that can start to embrace these concepts around price and deliver to your clients more client-friendly, more client-centric pricing that benefits both parties. Okay, so I'll let you read through these. And this is the big question: why? Why a strategy for pricing? So obviously, first and foremost, pricing is complex. It's way more complex, I think, than a number in a conversation or on a piece of paper. So it deserves a more thoughtful approach. The whole idea, everything about pricing happens over a longer period of time, I think, than most of us recognize. So it's not a single moment in time. It's not just that piece of paper that drops in someone. It has to do with information people have heard, other sources of information, et cetera. So pricing is a much longer duration than we believe it to be. And if this is all done properly, like I said before, it can benefit both parties. It can increase revenue and profit inside of your organization, all the while improving relationships with clients. And so it benefits everybody. Okay, so there's a lot of words here. I'm going to let you read through these, and then I'll talk about it. So there's a whole, like I mentioned, there's a bunch of parts of successful pricing strategy. We're going to talk about some of these. This is a much longer conversation. If we get there, if we decide the group at Pi decide we need to do a part 2 on this, I'm happy to do that as well, to dig into some of this. Obviously, pricing should be approached with a plan. Offering options is really, really critical in pricing, but not too many. I reference a book and an associated TED Talk that I have that I have seen by Barry Schwartz called The Paradox of Choice. It is fascinating. If you haven't watched it, you should, but it relates to the very curious way our brain operates around choice, not too many, not too few, and how choice impacts decision making. Designing those options that we bring together in a proposal around what matters most to the client, what they value the most. And the last thing there in that first column is leveraging cognitive bias in your pricing strategy. And if you aren't familiar with cognitive bias, we'll talk about it a little bit today. It's infinitely fascinating to me. The second column, we talk about focusing on outcomes and results rather than inputs and deliverables. That enables and leads to value pricing and having pricing conversations around focused on value. Risk, understanding the impact of risk and pricing, the relationship between risk and pricing, and being able to balance that and leverage risk in pricing. And last bullet there, using pricing premiums and levers when we negotiate things like price can create win-wins for both the clients and the consultant, proposing agency, whoever it is. We're going to talk mainly about everything in the first column. Like I said, in the second column, if we see an opportunity in the future to develop something around value pricing and other things, we can talk about that. So we're going to focus mainly on the first three. So here's before we dig into those, I want to talk about how we price, how anything is priced, how consumer products are priced, how professional services are priced, whatever it is. How does the world approach pricing? Now, there's a lot of different ways, but I'm going to talk about three. And these are the three main ones. And the first one is called cost plus, right? It's focused on time, inputs, and level of effort. Organizations they assemble a price based on a foundation of, maybe hourly units. How many hours will it take? What's the price of those hours to complete this work? And they set that price. So that's a cost plus focus. That's an internally focused mechanism of creating and determining price. And if a lot of you are involved in services industries, that's typically how your firms produce price. The second is market-based, and a lot of times consumer products will be market-based. So it's focused completely on external factors, competition, what someone is willing to pay, comparing one item to the other item, et cetera. So it's an external focus of price setting. The third is customer value. So it's focused on client outcomes. So this turns the setting of price and the ultimate kind of decision making around price completely on the customer, right? The customer is given the ability to choose price based on the value they associate with what they get out of a purchase. So those are three very general ones, and I'm going to talk about one specifically, and that's the first one. That if you're in the services industry, you're likely focused on cost plus, and I'm going to beat up cost plus in time and hours a little bit here, and I'm going to let you read through that. Okay, so a lot of organizations, service organizations, I work with architects, engineers, economists, analysts. I work financial advisors. I work with a lot of those folks, and most of them approach pricing in a cost plus fashion. Some of the problems with that, some of you may be aware of those and see them and see the problems that sort of creates, but some of them are listed here, right? Using cost plus hours and time, these foundational building blocks, which is an hourly rate, dealing with units of time, it presents a conflict of interest to the buyer because the buyer wants to spend less, have whatever outcomes that they want to achieve, take less time to get there, and the consultant on the other end of it wants the inverse. They understand the complexities of it and understand that this is going to take some time and therefore it's going to be expensive. So right out of the get-go, it creates a potential conflict. Time and materials. Now, not all pricing is based on time and materials, but when time and materials sort of comes up as a price or a pricing option, it shifts all the risk to the buyer because there is no known dollar amounts. If it's a time and materials approach to pricing, the buyer really doesn't know ultimately what they're going to pay, right? And that's very risky for them. Time and materials using billable hours, et cetera, fosters a production mentality, particularly firms who are really focused on utilization, focused on production rather than effectiveness and creativity, the ability to complete a certain amount of work in a shorter amount of time than paid for, while still achieving client outcomes, so that you increase profit and maximize sort of effectiveness and efficiency. Cost plus approaches disregard the relative nature of price. They price the work to be done and not necessarily client, because clients all perceive pricing and value differently. You can complete the same amount of work for two different clients, same or similar amounts of work for two different clients who have radically different desired outcomes from that amount of work. So the value they place on the work that you're doing with them or for them is different. It punishes experience and expertise rather than rewarding it. And I wrote there, the experienced team members are slightly more expensive, but dramatically faster. The situation often arises that you have the opportunity to have junior team members who are generally less expensive. The costs are lower for those individuals to complete a certain amount of work, and you can have much more experienced team members to complete a certain amount of work. A lower cost team member to complete a certain task takes them 10 hours. A more experienced team member can maybe take just 2 hours. And what happens a lot of time, if you're basing your cost and pricing on the time spent, even though the more experienced team member is more expensive, the overall time spent is radically less. So ultimately, the client pays less, which from a client perspective sounds great. But what you should be doing is actually the inverse, is that the experience and expertise that the senior team members bring to it should actually be worth more and be priced higher than the less experienced junior team member. And this approach to this cost plus building blocks doesn't achieve that situation. And lastly, clients buy outcomes, not hours. Clients, generally speaking, do not know what you as a professional can complete over the course of an hour, so they don't know what dollar amount or value to assign to that. That's a problem. Okay, so we're going to dig into some of these ideas I introduced earlier: offering options, designing these price options, and leveraging cognitive bias. So let's dig into these. Okay. Let's talk about offering options. And I'm going to come at these from a pretty high level. I'm not going to get too specific because I know there's a lot of people from a lot of different industries here. I know a lot of you are involved, likely in the creation of proposal documents, but not necessarily in setting price. You may be. But the important thing to remember here is that as proposal professionals, as people who are, either designing, a price proposal that's delivered in person or on a piece of paper, it's critical that all of you start to recognize what good pricing practices are and what good price looks like, right? So offering options, and you've likely read through this so far. So offering options, buyers want choice. We all want choices. We're all buyers. We want choice. That is a fundamental truth across all buyers. Choice permits buyers to own and author the final decision, the final price. That's what choice gives us. Options provide the necessary context for buyers to compare alternatives. If buyers are completely unable to make a decision based on a single alternative because there's simply a lack of context around that to which they can compare. If you constantly provide one option in your proposals, the only way a buyer can compare that is to someone else, right? So the opportunity in presenting options in your proposal gives the necessary context for comparison within your proposal, within itself. That said, too many choices can lead to paralysis where no decision is made. This harkens back to that the paradox of choice, Barry Schwartz, what I talked about earlier. But there is a Goldilocks approach. If I'm kind of assuming that people know the Goldilocks, the three bears, etc. But there is a sweet spot that you can create with pricing choices. And it's entirely possible to create a best choice, a most desired choice at the right price with the right elements incorporated into it, giving proper context around that. So that's offering options, and it's just fundamental. Options are critical. Okay, let's talk about designing the price options. Okay, so when we design price options, 3 options provide the sufficient context and can frame a best choice. 2 is often too little. 4 is okay, but starts to get kind of difficult. And beyond 3, 4, 5 different options in a pricing proposal starts to get really confusing, because if you're picturing it with me, you're starting to put together sort of a matrix of choice. And if you provide too many choices, that matrix gets really, really complex. So we'll talk about that. Very clear, simple pricing tables help buyers understand what options they have to choose, and the price associated with each one of those options. We can use visual techniques as proposal creators, writers, designers. We can assemble these options in a way and use visual techniques that can nudge or guide decision making, and I'll show an example right after this. And the last 2 things I have on this slide have to do with cognitive bias. We can, depending on how our options are put together and ordered from first, second, third, ABC, whatever that order is, high, medium, low, low, medium, high, the ordering effect, literally the order in which those options are presented in a document or in a conversation can place a bias on the first option introduced. Cognitive bias. The second one there, the decoy option, is another form of cognitive bias, and we'll dig more into cognitive bias in just a bit. But a decoy option can influence decision making on 2 other options, and a decoy option can be an extremely low option or an extremely high option that somehow impacts the other 2. You would tend to think that individual options are considered individually on their own merit, but they aren't. All the options are considered in reference to others, and a decoy option can drive attention or focus towards 2 others. So this is these are powerful tools. Okay, so here's a couple examples, and this is just totally random examples. And a lot of people are looking at this thinking, we price very complex, high dollar professional services that are hundreds of thousands or many millions of dollars. And Marcus here showing us, a software as a service 3 option table. Then you may think that absurd, but I will posit this. The professional, the business, the B2B buyer's mind is being radically shifted towards this type of a purchasing model. Organizations large and small, again and again, are being put through these types of pricing decisions that are leveraging, modern pricing approaches like tables, like 3 option choices, and to think that even very high dollar professional services or other offerings can't start to leverage these same concepts is naive. So even simple tables like this can have a radical impact on pricing, even in very complex services. So this example right here, there's a few things going on. There's a tapering and increasing options involved in these 3 layers. There is clearly one choice that is kind of the Goldilocks central choice, that is the best value choice, that is highlighted and sort of called out visually. And there is a high dollar pricing option that I would say is likely representing the decoy option in these 3 options here, steering people towards what is, like I said, the best value or the highest value or the desired option, which is option 2. So this is a pricing table from Salesforce. All of you are familiar with that particular CRM product. Um, they give you these tables. This table shows you everything you get with a green little check mark and things that you do not get with a little X mark. Again, visual cues using various pricing techniques um, to arrive at a price. So this is used throughout the software as a service industry, but it absolutely can start to apply to even complex pricing at your organizations. Um, Here's how we can change how we price. We can start to, and I'm seeing some comments there, and we can talk about those a little bit, and uh, we'll get to all of that because I think some of the comments are related to um, we're put in a box on how we need to provide price, and I think that that's fair in some situations, and we can talk through that a little bit. Here's how we can change how we can price, and you can read through these. Okay. Okay. We can shift from what a lot of firms might do, spreading pricing elements, delivery elements, random numbers, ranges across a document. We can consolidate those on one page, and we can shift that information towards the front of our documents, to these proposals that we create, to make them easier to understand and more client friendly. We can start to use simple 3-option tables that are easy to read and to understand. Um, we can explore different. I hear all of you can start to explore different ideas with your team. A lot of people think, if we're going to offer options, what are they? And I think a lot of times when we propose, there are kind of inferred options, exclusions, other types of things that are not incorporated into a single offering or a single price. We can start to see how those things can start to come into options. A number of excluded services or excluded offerings can come into a third option. So you can, I mean, if you look through your existing proposals that you've created historically or even recently, hopefully you can start to find those options that are either inferred. There's often those little one-liners that say, "Oh, and if you want this, we can do that too." Those can be incorporated into specific options. There are opportunities, particularly when you are proposing for very, very complex work. There are often opportunities to develop very small, let's just get started options for very large projects, which means that, if it's hundreds of thousands of dollars or even millions of dollars, ultimately in price, in services that you're going to deliver, there often is an opportunity to present a very simple, let's just get started and get our heads wrapped around what the complexity and the scope of all of this is together, where you can actually start to get paid for some of that really important initial pricing scoping work that's to be done. And ultimately, you can start to think how you can shift away from task-based options, which a lot of people start to think initially, and what I see in a lot of 3-option proposals, to where we start to shift to client-centered value-based options, where we're listing elements of work to be done that are more associated with what elements a client places value on and what they do not, and including or excluding those on various pricing levels and options. So these are just some ways that we can start to change individually and organizationally on how we perceive and look at price. Okay, here's the bottom line with providing options. If we provide options, it lets our customers, our clients, our prospective clients choose how they will buy from you, not if. And all too often, we are providing a take it or leave it price in our proposals, and without the sufficient context that buyers need to make important decisions. Okay, so that's the first two elements right there. Options, and then sort of designing those options. Now we're going to talk about cognitive bias, and you can read through these. Okay. Cognitive bias is a systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in our judgment. I think um, a lot of times we assume or we believe that decision making, I mean, even our personal decision making, but particularly when we are presenting pricing in a business context in a buying selling situation, we assume that buyers are bringing logical, rational decision making and judgment to the process, but most often they are not. Many decisions that ultimately are made are unconscious and fast decisions. Uh, Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and he talks about two different systems. System one is fast thinking, and system two is slow thinking. Maybe I'm getting those reversed. Um, but a lot of times we assume that things are happening in a rational, deliberate, logical fashion, but often they are not. And those fast decision-making processes that happen a lot of times in any situation are impacted by cognitive bias. So awareness of cognitive bias is critical in the buying and selling process. Both as a buyer, you need to be aware of what's happening in our heads, but as a seller, we need to understand what's happening as we present different options, as we walk through pricing discussions, and potentially how we can leverage cognitive bias with our buyers to come up with a final decision-making situation where it's beneficial for both parties. I think a lot of people will think of cognitive bias as how we can trick buyers. That's not always that's not what we're talking about here. Okay, here's a few types of cognitive bias. There are many, but here's a few, and here's a few that are related to pricing. Anchoring is the, sorry, I'm going to let you read these first. You go ahead. I know there's a lot of information on this slide. Okay. So anchoring is the tendency to rely too much on information that is presented early. Pricing strategy demands that we take extreme care in how we deal with price early in early conversations, and it can be information that we provide as a service provider, or as a consultant agency, whatever. It can be information that is available that can be researched and obtained. We have to be very conscious and very careful with what happens early on with pricing, because all too often a buyer will get a number buried into their head and there's no extracting it. It has buried itself into their brain and there is no steering clear of it whatsoever. If they set $100,000 in their head and you come back 2 weeks later and it's now gone to $200,000, they're always going to have that initial $100,000 price, and everything will be compared relative to that. So anchoring happens with all of us, even as consumer buyers. Anchoring occurs. So we have to be careful about how we deal with anchoring. Loss aversion is the tendency to prefer avoiding losses over acquiring equivalent gains, which is very interesting, and it's often difficult to explain, and I'm going to do my best. So losing elements, if you present options and they have various elements in them, presenting options that are high-priced options that have many elements, removing those options from that high-priced, removing those elements from that high-priced option has a greater impact on us as decision makers than starting with a small low-priced option and starting to stack things on top of it. We will be more hesitant to start with a large item and have things removed to lower the price than we will to have a small, maybe I'm getting this backwards. I know it's really difficult. So the point loss aversion, how loss aversion wraps into pricing, is that people feel more pain when they start to pull elements away rather than have them sort of added onto the various elements or pricing elements, etc. So let's come back to this. I often get myself backwards and sideways on loss aversion, but we can talk more, and hopefully some of you are coming up with some general ideas about how we are loss averse in our decision making. Okay, confirmation bias. is a tendency to jump to conclusions that confirm what we always believe to be true, whether or not they are true. It's based on just beliefs. And the sunk cost fallacy is committing to something that you've invested time and energy in, despite any future negative outcomes. And we'll talk about how these all sort of play out here. So sorry about my stumbling over loss aversion, but we can dig into that if people have some questions about it. Okay. So here's how we can be conscious of and leverage cognitive bias, and I'll let you read through these. Okay, so here's leveraging cognitive bias. So anchoring high, presenting high numbers in a smart, effective way early on in pricing conversations and in buying, selling situations make future lower prices seem more reasonable. So rather than presenting low prices initially and then having higher prices come into the conversation later on, if we are strategic about how we leverage those high anchors, future conversations with where the dollars start to diminish, suddenly those prices seem way more reasonable than they would have independently. It's leveraging that sort of high anchoring. We can leverage loss aversion by presenting and showing very clearly what's included and what's excluded with various options, not just stacking everything that's included, but also being very explicit about what's not included, conjuring this powerful sense of loss aversion that will impact how decisions are made between options. We can call out expectations, this confirmation bias. We can call out expectations very early on in conversations and in documents that can mitigate perceptions of individuals kind of coming into a situation. Oh, they're a high cost provider, or they're going to approach this a particular way, or whatever their bid or their proposal is going to include certain things. We can call out, be explicit, name those things early on to kind of mitigate that initial sort of confirmation bias that buyers come into this process with. And the sunk cost fallacy, we can leverage that by offering those initial get started options with low price that starts us down a path together, putting resistance in place, preventing them from wanting to head elsewhere for future work. That's how we can leverage that. Okay. I believe, and I have seen, leveraging cognitive bias in pricing can be a competitive advantage. You can, without pricing options, along with all of these various cognitive bias tools, without that, you will leave, without being aware of this cognitive bias, you will leave this whole decision-making process sort of, up to the whims of your buyers. So awareness of cognitive bias and then understanding how you can leverage it is critical, because others that you compete against and other buyers that you work with will not be as in tune and aware of it. So here's a summary, and I'll let you read through this. Okay. So here's kind of a wrap up of everything we talked about here. It is important, whether or not you are involved in the sales conversations in the sales process, but at your organization, it's critical to start institutionalizing these pricing ideas into early sales conversations that uncover client needs, start to introduce things like high anchors, and help you create and inform various options or various ways that you can approach particular work, i.e. how you can develop those options. Starting to standardize 3-option proposals in your organization, and this is just how you deliver your pricing. Starting to standardize that approach gives buyers the options that they want to have to make an informed sort of decision that they own and they can author. Creating user-friendly, client-friendly, well-designed, very clear pricing tables will make it easier to buy from you and your organization. Starting to research and understand within your organization, all of your team members starting to understand how cognitive bias works and how it influences decision making, not just internally but externally with your buyers, is critical. You can start to implement various techniques, some of those we talked about today, that leverage this fast thinking, this often irrational approach to decision making, using high anchoring, low price options, loss aversion in your 3-option proposals. We can start to leverage those and steer the decision making of our buyers. And lastly, you can start to lead a culture inside your organization that moves just beyond this basic cost plus pricing, that embraces a more value-driven approach that is easier and more client-centric, and ultimately benefits not just you but your organization. Okay, that is just a little taste of a strategy for pricing. We will open it up to all questions, thoughts, comments, etc. I will stop sharing the screen and we can go from there.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. That was fantastic. And for those on the chat, Mark presented this to the Baker's Dozen maybe 5 months ago. Some of this information, and in that time, I've had a chance to implement it in some of my client bids. And it has certainly changed the conversation. Specifically for one organization, it became this, well, we see that we're getting excluded. So this was the loss aversion piece. We presented 2 tables and then did the blue dots down one side and the X's at the bottom, hollow dots actually, that indicated they weren't getting something. And it became this conversation around, well, what about those things that we're getting excluded from? And even though there's no way they can afford the largest option, they're like, is there any way that we can do a la carte? Like it became this interesting back and forth during the conversation phase of the bid. And as I always tell my sales team, the more times they talk to us, that is the better for us. So anything that sparks that conversation. So Mark, I actually have a question. So Jennifer Burgon is saying would definitely attend a part 2. Perfect. So we'll have to set that up. So Mark, obviously, as we have, I think as bid managers and proposal managers, we have a lot of ability about some of the things that we can do to present, but the actual strategy around doing it often seems to be set at the sales level. Is there a training that you recommend for salespeople, or is there something that we can demonstrate for them?
Yeah, there's and I scratch the surface, and again, I kind of qualify that sort of pricing expertise thing. I consider myself a student of pricing. There's so much wonderful information out there. There's a handful of people I listed on that last slide that have done a lot about pricing. Ron Baker, Blair Enns. If anybody's heard of Blair Enns, he's a fellow Canadian. Ben, he has a podcast called Two Bobs. He runs a practice called Win Without Pitching. His world is focused on creative agencies, but it works well with other types of professional services firms. There's a firm called Blue Turtle Consulting that does really fabulous work around pricing and reiterates a lot of the stuff that I've talked about here. There's a ton of really fabulous information out there about pricing strategy, et cetera, that not just sort of proposal managers should be sort of aware of. I think everyone in the entire organization, particularly on the sort of sales side, should be aware of this. I think we've just arrived on this approach to pricing where we just, assemble all these hours and blocks, throw them in a big pile and say, that's our one price, take it or leave it, without really understanding that buyers want options, that this irrational cognitive bias is happening in our heads. So I think it's critical. And I think people as proposal managers inside of organizations can be the spark and the impetus around better pricing. Because I think even a lot of sales professionals really don't fully embrace um, that we can be creative with pricing. And even if a client is asking for one particular option, we can provide three options. And we can provide one option that's a low cost option that puts us in a position where we don't have to be a high cost provider. That probably has a limited scope and just gets us started. We can provide an option that aligns with a particular budget. And we can provide a third option that says, look, here's the kitchen sink. Here's everything that we've thought of that that needs to be, brought to bear in order for you to achieve the outcomes you want to achieve. And that can be a really high priced option. And Ben, serve the function of what you mentioned there, introduce a number of elements and ideas that they wouldn't have otherwise considered, and start to create this really powerful desire about, oh, we really want those things. Mm-hmm. And what I have seen in a lot of my clients is the middle option, the Goldilocks option that starts to emerge, is at least 10% higher than if they would have presented a number independent of other options. No. So if you can start, like, this is worth 10% on every single proposal that you can put together. I can almost guarantee it. All of the examples that I have seen, even done it myself, there is that delta right there between if we'd have just put together one number and thrown it at the client versus putting three, and then the chosen option is ultimately a little bit higher than that original number. So really powerful.
It's great. And I do have a question from the audience. So Rebecca, how do you suggest handling the issue of procurement wanting line itemization and then striking certain line items in an attempt to save cost?
Yeah, I think that I'm not ever recommending that firms be non-compliant, but I think that both sort of from sort of an executive summary approach, I think it is client friendly and reviewer friendly to try to simplify options and pricing and collect it into a simple, easy to understand table, backed then by whatever level of detail is required, appropriate, needed, whatever else. So I think what people will do is they'll put pages and pages of detail, and a lot of times this will be required, or they'll put pages and pages of detail to kind of rationalize their pricing. They're like, oh yeah, look at, we just gave you 30 pages of scope. Of course it's worth $3 million. Mm-hmm. So I think if we reorder that, if we put all the detail, like I said, whatever's required, whatever's needed in the back, if we push our summaries up front, it just makes it easier and better for buyers to review and understand, and then go get the detail when needed.
So what I'm hearing from that is your response to someone wanting line itemization is present your pricing earlier somewhere else and more simplified. It's kind of a way to grab attention. Would you actually put your pricing table inside an executive summary? I'm curious.
Well, executive summaries are usually associated with a narrative. Yeah. But if you wanted to, you could, structuring the actual document, how those pages all start to fit together, or the order of the particular conversation. I think we wait too long to introduce pricing. And what happens inevitably is that someone who is reviewing a document that has to flip through 30 or 40 pages in order to get to sort of the big number, that's frustrating from a buyer standpoint. And it feels like a little bit like we're trying to hide that information where we shouldn't be. We should be very upfront with it and say, look, we've come up with, a pricing range. We come up with three options. They range from this dollar amount to this dollar amount. Here they are on our nice little table, and the supporting information is back behind that. Now let's talk.
Interesting. Rebecca follows up with that, indicating that she would be interested in seeing an example of a proposal.
Mm-hmm. If we can think just about simple reordering, it's instead of having tables and summaries towards the end, just push it towards the front. In my proposals, I like, to have a very clear articulated understanding. So we're reflecting back to the prospective client, what we've heard, to the buyer, what we've heard, what we understand their needs are. You can follow that up with, a nice little pricing table. And then after that, you can have an approach put together with all of your pricing there. Everyone either has highly prescriptive or less so, ways they have to put together a proposal. Some are prescriptive to the point where there's no flexibility whatsoever. Yep. And hopefully those are the minority of situations you find yourself in rather than the majority. But yeah, I would, whenever possible, just stay centered on the buyer, try to make it easier and easier for them to make decisions. And because that's what this is about. Buying and selling is about, facilitating decision making. Cognitive bias helps us steer decision making, and very clear, basic, simple information in things like tables make it more buyer friendly. So if we can make decision making easier, we will be a more favorable choice over a competitor that has made decision making for them harder.
Okay. So good point on the prescriptive. Like when I was junior in the industry, I would follow these things to the letter of the law, but more and more I find myself ripping apart pricing tables or presenting like, here's my pricing helper document and here's your mandatory whatever you've given me.
Yeah, just do two. Just do. And people have said, that they provide templates for us to fill in. That's totally fine. Chances are good the templates and the information, the prescriptive approach to their pricing, how you roll up pricing, et cetera, might not be, it's probably made by somebody, who isn't, maybe is one of the decision makers, but not all the decision makers. We have to think across a group of decision makers because, ultimately buying decisions are often made across a group of individuals. And we have to be able to assemble price in a way that's really easy to understand for everyone, because different individuals have different ways that they perceive price. So yeah, provide all the templates required, everything else, but I would take any opportunity that you can to present price in a very, very simple, clear fashion where it's all kind of put together. Anytime you have a buyer who has to flip back and forth and be cross-referencing different sections and different documents to try to figure out what price is, it makes buying harder.
100%. Okay. Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, I have one that I'm going to load up that Mark might need to save for presentation too. And as we, so I'll let someone type that in, but just something for me to think about. So, and obviously this might be too broad, or maybe it's a really easy question and I'm overthinking it. I worry that if I put my pricing near the top of the document, that it will color the narrative of everything else that I place beneath it. That they may oh, well, none of these numbers match what I had in my head when I had my budget in mind, and I'm just disregarding everything these people are talking about.
Right. That's the critical nature of options. If I present, and when I present price early, either in a conversation or in a document, I typically will do it in one of two ways. I will say, we are presenting three options that range in price from this to this, or we are presenting three options that have this price, and this price, right? So what overwhelms that sense of, oh my gosh, this is going to be really expensive? What dominates in that situation is, oh, this is interesting. I'm curious to see what options they've come up with.
Okay.
Right. Just early on, if you're able to present and say, look, we have three options that have a range, then I think you're able to sort of diffuse that. And that goes into that little sort of confirmation bias where someone's going to see your cover letter and they're like, oh, these guys, they're expensive.
Yeah.
Right. Or they're going to approach this a certain way, whatever else. And, so I think if you present pricing early in a conversation or a document, you should talk about ranges. Your ultimate price, just to be clear, when I talk about ranges, I'm talking about the ranges of option 1 to option 3 in your 3-option proposal. I never recommend that organizations present a range as a choice, because ultimately, if you are presenting a range, you are giving them an infinite number of choices, which creates paralysis, which creates friction, which makes the decision-making process harder.
Okay. So 3 nice, clear, concise numbers.
One number, 2 number, 3 number. Yep.
Fantastic. All right. It is 10:56. If there are no more questions, I will certainly discuss with Mark about the possibility of a seminar 2 somewhere in the new year.
Yeah.
All right,
yeah. And anyone, my website's wainwrightinsight.com. Hopefully you can navigate that. Just look me up on LinkedIn or wherever else. You are welcome independently to follow up with me if you have any additional questions. Understanding that, There might be other people in your organization who are ultimately, kind of in charge of price, but having the opportunity to influence, increase the knowledge across your organization around price is critical.
Yeah, and I would really love to get to value-based pricing. A lot of my clients talk about it, and we continue to submit cost-plus proposals or T&M proposals.
Yeah, yeah, and just 1 second on that. Value pricing is very complex. It is enabled only through a deep understanding of what a client places a value on, and then the subsequent price they would be willing to pay for that. So it requires an in-depth conversation with the client to understand what's important to them. Sometimes those conversations are hard, maybe impossible to have with particular clients. But I would also say that when I present, and in my proposals, I will present a value priced option. And that generally has to do with maybe additional layers or elements. Maybe there's a performance component to that where, hit a certain goal, metric, whatever else, achieve that, there's additional dollars involved, whatever else. I typically will not present all three options that are completely value-based. My work in general is value-based because it's not necessarily associated with hours and time. But that's my practice. Yeah, it's again, value-based pricing, I think, is a catchy word, but there's a whole lot to it. And first and foremost, the ability to value price something sits completely in the opportunity for you to have a conversation with your client to understand what they value. Because you can't price something related to a client value if you don't understand client value. Maybe you're making an assumption on what the client would value, and that's impossible.
All right. We have one more quick question. Just a heads up while Rebecca's typing that up. This will be distributed to everyone that's on the original email, a recording of it, and then it'll be posted in our community as well, where Mark does lurk and provide pricing insights and sometimes skewers people. So for a SaaS company that proposes both software plus services, are we talking about just the software, or is it a recommendation to include services pricing upfront as well?
No, definitely both. Absolutely. I think a lot of times, a lot of SaaS companies don't. Those that do start to wrap in services have the opportunity to, value price those services. Hopefully, those services aren't based on sort of a cost plus pricing mechanism, because it's, a lot of times professional services in addition to the software is considered sort of a value add, right? So absolutely, I think it would make a ton of sense. I think that you can present options that are, here's your 1,000 seats for the software, here's your seats plus, plus additional services, and then here's an option with, sort of perpetual licenses and ongoing support and, all that sort of stuff. So it's, software kind of lends itself pretty easily to it. How you weave services into that absolutely gives you the ability to put together three really compelling options.